everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great, I'll kick things off. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to tonight's program. I'm Alexis Offen, the Executive Director of the 14th Street Y. We're very excited to feature Always Carry Salt, Samantha Ellis in conversation with Jordan Salama. For those of you who are less familiar with our organization, 14Y is downtown's Jewish community center. We have a long-standing history as a home for exciting, thought-provoking Jewish arts and ideas as we explore the vibrancy and vitality and diversity of Jewish culture. We are thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program, celebrating this book, and we'll begin the evening with a conversation between Samantha and Jordan, exploring the larger themes and questions at the heart of the book. Then we'll have a Q&A, and following that, we invite you to join us downstairs in our lobby for a book signing with both authors. Tonight's program is presented by the 14th Street Y and the Jewish Book Council. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, which include the American Sephardi Federation, the Chol Lashon, the Endangered Language Alliance, Hebrew Union College Jewish Language Project, Knis, Sephardic Brotherhood, and the Sephardic Mizrahi Q Network. I also want to especially thank Evie Sapphire Bernstein from the Jewish Book Council, who's been an incredible partner on tonight's event. We thank them all for their support. I'd also like to invite you to join us for other Jewish programs this season. On February 6th, we'll have a conversation and gallery reception celebrating Hyphen, an exciting new graphic novel anthology that brings to life personal stories from diverse Jewish experiences. You can see some of those panels from the graphic novels in this hallway here and in our lobby gallery below. And on February 9th, we'll present Kedma Song Circle, a special interactive exploration of Middle Eastern song. Please see the QR code on the back of your programs or look out for our newsletters for more, and I hope you'll join us. It's now my great pleasure to turn it over to Samantha and Jordan to begin our conversation. Let's give them a round of applause.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Hi Samantha. I'm so grateful, first of all, to everybody who came, but especially grateful to Samantha, who came from London to be with us today. When I found out about this book more than a year ago now, I guess it was, and I added on order from the UK, I read it maybe in a day and a half. It was so good and so special, and I think ever since then I've been trying to basically encourage you to come once it came out in the United States, so I'm really glad this is...
Well, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks everyone for coming.
Well, I guess we want to start with, maybe you can describe the book a little bit, and then you're going to read a short section from the preface. Is that right? Okay.
So this book really started, it started 6 years ago. My son is now nearly 9. It started when he was 2, and my parents are both Iraqi Jews. My father left in 1951 and my mother left in 1971. And I always knew that our language was vanishing. I mean, it wasn't news to me, but there was a conversation that I had in a playground in London that really sort of hit me. My little boy was 2, he was on a roundabout, and there was this other mum, she was French, and she was talking to her child, half in French, half in English, and I said, do you go to there was a lovely, bilingual French nursery where they all wear very, very clean dungarees and they eat pain au chocolat every meal, and I was like, do you go to that one? Because I've been quite keen to send my son there, it was so nice. And she said, yeah. I said, I really wanted my son to be bilingual, I wanted him to go there, we didn't get in. And she said, but you're not French. And I said, no. She said, why didn't you send him to a nursery for your language? And I said, because my language is dead. And then I burst into tears, really quite hysterical tears, to the point where I had to not go to that playground for quite a long time because it was so embarrassing. And I sort of scooped up my son and zipped off home. And I suddenly thought, I really feel like I need to know more about what I'm losing before it's gone. And I wanted to, it wasn't going to be a book initially, but it very quickly became clear that there was something gathering that I wanted to put down. I'm just going to read you a little bit. I didn't start the book then because the pandemic happened, and I spent most of the pandemic watching horrendous children's TV with my son while sitting there on my phone, sort of Googling, is there an archive, is there a dictionary, what are people doing? to preserve our language. So I'll just read you a little bit. It was 2021. My son, 4.5, splashing in the bath, asked me, "What does fudwa mean?" He'd heard my mother call me that. I didn't want to tell him it means I would die for you. So I just said it means I love you very much. "Well, why don't you call me that then?" he said. I didn't know what to say. Fudwa felt too dramatic a term of endearment, although I would die for him. I couldn't say it. Fudwa carries my family's danger, drama and trauma, which I wanted to leave behind when I became a mother, not to pass on. Although I was born in London, have always been safe from the persecution my family experienced in Iraq, and have never had to face the rupture of leaving home. I was a worried child and an anxious adult. I imagined trauma gnawing through generation after generation, like the caterpillar eating his way through fruit and cake and sausages in The Very Hungry Caterpillar, except at the end you didn't turn into a butterfly, but a guilt-stricken neurotic with recurrent nightmares. I was determined to break the cycle because after all we were both safe, weren't we? I wrapped him in the towel which made him look like a tiny dinosaur with fabric spikes over the hood. And he said it, Fudwa, and I melted. He loved me very much, although I felt really worried because it was the wrong way round. I was the grown-up. I was supposed to be saying it to him. But still, we were talking. We were talking Judeo-Iraqi Arabic. We were talking about love and also about death. I wanted to know more about why my language was going extinct and about what else we keep and what we lose. How we decide what to let go of, and how sometimes we don't get to make that decision. How sometimes we don't get to make those decisions, but are swept up by history or politics or fate. I was acutely aware that difficult family stories can weigh us down, but also that sometimes our ancestors give us the survival kits we need to be resilient and to heal. It seemed crucial now to think much more deeply about all this, about what we pass on. Not just as parents, if we become parents, but what we put out into the world, the legacies we leave, the ideas we give, the stories we tell, the contributions we make, the kindnesses we are hopefully remembered for, the food we cook for friends. I needed to understand the stories of my culture and community before they were lost, or worse, erased, so I could tell them to my son and to anyone else who cared to listen. I wanted to work out how to be a good future ancestor myself. I wanted to write down the recipes. I wanted to hold the things, the objects my parents brought from Iraq and keep them safe and know their stories. And I wanted to think about what I might pass on, what memories, what imprints, and I wanted to do it fast. It felt as if a flood was coming and I needed urgently to build an ark.
How to be a good future ancestor is a question that I think a lot of Jewish people think about all the time, but especially those of us who belong to increasingly shrinking Jewish communities, such as the Iraqi Jewish community, of which my family is also part. So as a disclaimer, I probably should say that the reason this sounds like inside baseball is because my family also left in the 1970s from Baghdad. And so when I read this book, it was like settling into a very familiar home, because all of the things that you mentioned are things that I recognize. And that's not something that you usually find when you read Jewish books when you come from Baghdad in the 1970s. So, in the essence of being the best future ancestors that we can be, I think first we have to talk about, as the book begins in its first section, about what we're losing. So why don't we talk about what is Judeo-Iraqi Arabic? What comprises the language, if we can call it a language itself? I think we can, as I know you can too. And why is it going away?
Well, I mean, first of all, not everyone even calls it that. I didn't even know what to Google when I was first searching. People call it Jewish Baghdadi, Judeo-Baghdadi. At home, we used to call it, Iraqis, please forgive my terrible accent. We used to call it Hakim al-Na, our talk. We used to call it Hakim al-Yahud, the talk of the Jews. We didn't, and usually we called the Arabic that other people spoke real Arabic, which always made ours sound a bit sort of secondary and unreal and not really, a solid language. A lot of people say it's a dialect. When I talk to linguists about this, they said that the way they define the difference between a language and a dialect is that there's an old joke that was made about Yiddish, that a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. So we were never going to have that. So there's not really a linguistic difference between the two. It's quite different though, because very briefly, when the Jews came over in 597 BCE, I'm going to be brief, they were speaking Hebrew, and they came into what is now Iraq, and everyone was speaking Aramaic. So they switched to Aramaic, but they carried over loads of Hebrew into it and made their own language, which was Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which of course is what the Talmud was written in. Then the Arab conquest came in the 6th century. Everyone switched to Arabic, but again, they carried over all this Hebrew and all this Aramaic. And I'm not just talking about words. Again, when I talk to proper linguists, they said they're carrying over constructions, they're carrying over grammar, they're carrying over phrases. So it really is quite a different language. And then a lot of these constructions stayed. So we both were studying it at nearly the same time at one point. And I don't know if you found this, but the professor who was teaching us kept saying, oh, well, everyone else who speaks Arabic has got rid of this really convoluted, annoying construction, but we've kept it. Isn't that amazing? And it's just like, thanks. But so it's actually studied quite a lot because it has these kind of ancient kind of constructions that have stayed in. And why we're losing it? Well, because there are only 3 Jews left in Iraq. And in the 1940s, Baghdad was 1/3 Jewish, so it's really a huge drop. The Jews who went to Israel from Iraq in 1950 to 51, there were 125,000 of them. They were encouraged to speak Hebrew and to give up their Arabic. And then the ones who stayed obviously kept speaking it, but they all spoke the language in the places they ended up. In my family, my parents were advised by a health visitor that they saw when I was a child that it would confuse me, so they didn't speak it to me. They spoke it to each other, and I heard it all, and I can understand it, but they didn't speak it to me. Also, they felt, what's the point? It's dying. What's the point in her learning it? What's the point in my brother learning it? It's not going to be there. So it's, and the definition of an endangered language is a language that's not being passed on to the kids. So a language can go from having many speakers to none in 1 or 2 generations.
And what did it do for you growing up, the realization that this language that you're hearing in your home and that you're hearing in your family, and the same thing has kind of happened to me over the last few years, is this realization that however many people there were who were speaking it, there's now fewer of them in our own lives. So how did that make you feel? What did that actually generate for you on a personal level, as you went through your life?
I just couldn't really comprehend it because it was so present. When I was really little, I thought that English was a kind of kids' language for sort of nursery picture books. I didn't think it was a real language that anyone serious would ever speak. And I thought, well, when I grow up, I'll speak the real language that my family speak. And then I went to school. It was a big shock. There are grown-ups who actually think this is worth speaking. This terrible language. And it was all around me, but it's around me less and less, and I find it devastating.
But what do we miss when we stop hearing the language in our lives? This is some of the details in your book that are the most beautiful, or the expressions that you talk about that go away. Not just the expressions, but the expression of emotion, of a certain way of being, almost, that disappears when this language goes away.
Yeah, I feel like it's a vibe, it's a world, it's it's a very kind of dramatic language, it's a very loving and warm language, it's a hot language. One of my first memories is of being about 3 or 4, I think, and sitting under the table in my grandmother's house, and above me all the adults were speaking and there's just smoke, Salama perfume, and everyone's got these fabulous manicures and they're all doing, and they're cooking. And I had a job, I'm sitting there and I was given a job to pull the stalks off the parsley to make tabbouleh. And so I have a tray of stalks and a tray of, leaves. And I just felt that was real life above my head, the gossip and the food and the arguments about how what you're putting in the food and all of this stuff. This was real life, and we've lost that. We're losing that, yeah.
Real life, I think, also important to mention in what context the language was spoken in Iraq, right? And in Baghdad, Judeo-Iraqi Arabic was used in a very specific setting.
Yeah, I mean, everyone spoke it at home, and they used to code switch all the time. My mum said, you know, you go out your front door and you go into, you know, the standard Arabic, you know, speaking Arabic, you know, the Arabic everyone else speaks, and you go, you know, to school and whatever. It depends, you know, it would depend. But once you went amongst your friends, you were speaking it again. So it was really spoken in the community, and it was, you know, it was a homey language, an intimate language, you know, a loving language, I guess. Yeah.
A loving language, it's true. And okay, so we've established that this language, which by the way is still spoken by thousands of people today.
Yeah.
It's just that these people, it's not being passed to the next generation, and these people
spoken by all of our parents, right?
Well, my parents no, but your parents, my grandparents and that generation for sure. But so we recognize that this is a language that's being lost, and so the question, I think, for you and certainly for me, and why I empathize with your book, is what are we going to do about it? Is it worth preserving a language when the context is gone?
Yeah, and I also think that I realised really quickly this book couldn't be just about language, because it's not just language, it's what the language is containing or expressing. So it's the stories, and it's the rituals, and it's the recipes, and it's the world, you know, it's everything.
Can you give me an example very quickly of one ritual or one tradition that you mentioned in the book that you think is really well exemplified to represent some of the things that Iraqi Jews do, maybe for those of us in the audience who aren't Iraqi?
I'm now gonna well, I suppose maybe I can give you an example of some of the phrases that I think are really important, because I feel like this is the kind of thing. So one moment where I thought I really am preserving this is my my son he was a little boy, he didn't know any of it. He would hear the odd words from my parents. And one day he was a toddler, and he was, I don't know why, he was throwing food or something, was being really annoying. And I suddenly just shouted, Tashmari, which means my head is exploding. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought, I've just shouted this in Arabic. He doesn't understand it. I don't know why I said it. I haven't heard that word for probably 30 years. And it just came out at this moment of sort of high emotion and kind of, and it's obviously something my mum used to say to me, when I was probably throwing food when I was a toddler. And I felt so connected to my mum, my grandma, sort of generations of women in my family when I said this, and I had to then explain, and we laughed about it. It was really, so there's a lot of kind of words and phrases, I think, associated with parenting that I found that I just didn't have to, like I didn't say foot words, we said, and and I just I didn't know how else to be a mum if I wasn't using the words, I suppose.
And so, back to my initial question in this part is when the context is going away, okay, so what is our responsibility? What should we do? What did you do once you had that realization that this is going to end?
Well, I did lots of things. For a start, I wanted to sort of gather what there was. So there are archives, there are phrase books, there are all sorts of things, and I was sort of gathering these kind of materials. I mean, I felt a little bit like I was, when you go on holiday and you kind of learn the word for, where is the post office or whatever, I was gathering, except for I wasn't going anywhere. I was going back into my own, my own story. And then there's this magical school that happens online called the Oxford School for Rare Jewish Languages. It is based in Oxford in the UK, but they teach all sorts of, I think 3 forms of Yiddish, 2 forms of Ladino, and they teach this. And so I joined these classes, which were revelatory. I as I said, I understand, but I don't speak. And when I said to my mum, "Oh, can you teach me some of the grammar?" she said, "There's no grammar in our language." I mean, there is grammar, but you never notice it when it's your own language. And so it was revelatory for that, but also it was amazing because there were people all over the world learning it. In my class, there was a Ukrainian woman, a South Korean woman, there was a man who was in Iraq, and there were lots and lots of Iraqi Jews like me, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation, different sort of removes from Iraq who were trying to get back to something. But I love the fact there were people who were not Iraqi Jewish who were learning it. It was like, oh, you could choose to do this, like you could choose to learn Spanish for your summer holiday, or you could, it's like any old language. I very quickly realised, I don't think I'm very good at languages. I wasn't really going to become, I had this idea I'm going to become fluent and then I'm going to teach it to my son, but then who's he going to speak it to? And I haven't become fluent. And then I read this amazing book by Ross Perlin. I'm sure a lot of you have read him. He's based here in New York at the Endangered Language Alliance, and he was writing about endangered languages, and he said, you can be a keeper as well as a speaker. And I thought, oh, maybe that's what I can do. I can be a keeper. So I started writing down as many phrases as I could, learning as much about the language, and that's why I wanted to put as much of that as possible into this book, because then other people can be the speakers, but at least I've done some keeping, I've done something.
Let's back up to the class 1 second, because the Oxford School of World Jewish Languages as an institution is fantastic, but Asaf Bar Moshe, who's the professor of this Iraqi Jewish Arabic course that both of us took separately on Zoom around the same time, which I think is so funny and amazing. He's a rare treasure because he is in his 30s and he's one of the few people of the next generation who was taught the language by his parents. And he, in his linguistics studies as a scholar of linguistics, he was encouraged by his advisor to abandon Mandarin Chinese and to move towards this in Israel, because he was told, you have this key. And so what I'm getting at with this is to say that he has made a textbook for a language that's not really historically a written language. It's an oral language, and that's why it's hard to express things like grammar, because it wasn't really written down all that much.
Yeah, I mean, he's codified a lot of it, which is sort of amazing. But yeah, he was going to do a PhD in Mandarin, and his supervisor apparently said, what are you doing? There's millions of people who could do that. You could do this. Hardly anyone can do it. And I bought his first book during the pandemic, and I just remember going down these kind of transcripts of conversations and writing down the words I already knew to see what I knew. It was quite depressing, actually. I got this list, and it was kind of, I knew the word for war, I knew the word for they hanged him, I knew the word for prison. I was like, this is kind of a list of reasons why we're not speaking the language anymore. But he's almost single-handedly been teaching it and promoting it and preserving it and making it available. So yeah, I mean,
he's the speaker that's allowing us all to be keepers.
Yes,
in
yes,
a way, right?
yeah.
But okay, so you brought up an interesting point, which is that the words that you were able to point out in some of his transcripts were the negative words. And we just talked about a little while ago how this is also a language of home and love and family and community, but it's also true that for a lot of people it's a language of a great deal of pain and trauma and displacement. I want to spend this time talking about the post-1950s and 1960s Jewish life in Iraq, just because I feel like most Iraqi stories, and I know you feel the same, Iraqi Jewish stories end at 1951 when the airlift brought out the vast majority of the Iraqi Jews to Israel. But our families stayed. And so they lived through an entire era of life in Iraq that was very different. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what they lived through and how you think that impacted their willingness or unwillingness to pass the language on, as opposed to the people who left before.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, like I said, my father left in 51, and his attitude was very different to my mother's. He was like, well, it's gone. Like, why are we, hankering after it? Whereas my mother and much of that side of the family were hankering after. I mean, I remember, one of the things I remember is sitting around having these conversations. They would have these conversations, and, when I was finally able to I picked up enough to understand, I realised that some of these conversations were incredibly boring. They were trying to work out what corner of what road someone lived and whether it was next. And I was like, why are they? But I realised they were trying to pin down, they were trying to map, pin down these maps of their minds. They were trying to go back there in their minds through these conversations. It was very moving now, but at the time I was like, isn't there something more exciting you can tell me?
Sorry, this is in the transcripts, or this is in your...
No, this is in my home. This is when I was young. So I think their attitudes, the people who left in 51, the people who left later, their views were quite different. I felt with this book that I had a chance to tell a big sweep. My grandmother passed away while this book was going to print, actually, and she was 95, and right up until very near the end, she had the most amazing memory for her life in Iraq. So she remembered the Farhud, the pogrom of 1941 in great detail. She was 11 at the time. So I had that. Then I had my father leaving in 51. But then, as you say, the untold story really was the 50s and 60s. I was really keen to get that down through my mother's story and my grandmother's story.
Just a quick aside, how many people stayed after 1951? How many people
We
left?
think about 15,000, something like that. Not a huge, so it was a tiny community, and some of them stayed because, you know, they were old, they didn't want to move. Some people stayed because they loved it and they never wanted to go anywhere else. Some people stayed. My grandfather had an inkling that they were going to end up in a transit camp in a tent, and he wasn't up for that, which I think is totally fair enough. And everyone had different reasons. You know, it's very hard to to pick up and move your entire life. And the 50s were largely good for the Jews of Iraq. You know, it's not you get the 40s, which are very difficult, and then the 50s is completely different. And then when it really starts to go wrong is after the Six-Day War in 67, when Iraq's Jews were blamed for the loss in that war, and there's all these sort of arrests and people being accused of being Zionist spies, and all these car bombs that go off in Baghdad, which are blamed on Jews, even though they're announced on the radio before the bombs have gone off, and there's no Jews anywhere near the cars that they've got. I mean, you know, it was all sort of, you know, confected. So it was that's the point where it became really difficult.
And Jews' passports were frozen and not allowed to leave the country for
Yes.
a certain amount of time. So people began to escape to the Shah's Iran.
Yes, and the Kurds are the real heroes of this story, because they were smuggling people over the border into Iran at great risk to themselves, and they saved a lot of people that way. And I mean, I think we can be nothing but grateful to them for doing that.
You quote a book in your book that is, I think, such an important point, which is that the Jew in Iraq opens his or her mouth and immediately identifies themselves.
Yes, so
because of the language,
because
the language is a Jewish language.
Absolutely, and they were constantly having to stop speaking it, and and I think again in the 60s they were. I mean, my mother said we didn't go out. We went to school and we came back. And we were at home. There were long periods of time when all the Jews' phones were cut off, so they couldn't even call each other or communicate with each other. There were periods where there were curfews for Jews, as well as, you know, not being allowed into further education for long periods of time. My mother finished school. She wasn't allowed to go to university, and so at the Jewish school there was I can't remember, it was the headmaster or one of the teachers who said, I'll just spend some time with whoever wants to and we'll do maths. So they did a year of maths just at the school, just classes. Then they decided to let in, I think, 4 or 6 Jewish kids to go to university. And my mother, we think she was sort of one of those because her father was a doctor, so everyone knew him, and this, you know, sort of let's have someone who everyone knows so that it looks like we're doing more. And they were in the papers, you know, these Jews are going to university. I mean, there were 4 or 6 of them. I mean, it was a very strange time. One of the friends my mum made at university, as one of the only 4 or 6 Jews in the whole university, asked where her horns were. I mean, you know, there were people at that point, they were encountering people who'd never met a Jew before, and this is only, you know, 20 years from Baghdad being 1/3 Jewish. You know, it's so quick to go to nothing like that.
So we're talking about a kind of at least 4 to 5 year period after the Six-Day War of these government cars coming to buildings and pulling people out of their houses, of people not sure whether they should stay or go, of people who escape, or people who wait for the windows when the government allows certain amounts of Jews to leave or not through certain kinds of, you know, agreements with other countries, all marked by this language. And so now we have the obviously vast majority, all but 3 or 4 people in Iraq today, of Iraqi Jews out of the country with this language. And for those of us who come from families that left late and lived through all of that, is there an association in your family, as there is in mine, of that language being one of all that went wrong? is there an association in your family, as there is with mine, of that language being associated with all that went wrong?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there was a sense of, we're never going to be able to go back. So that's another reason not to pass it on. And I mean, a lot of people when I was writing this book said, not Iraqi Jews, other people said to me, and of course in the last chapter you go back to Iraq, and I was like, no, I can't. And often people would question this, who are not Iraqi Jews, and say, well, why not? It would be a great last chapter. I mean, I agree, it would be a great last chapter. And there are, a handful of Jews who've gone to Iraq, but it's been a criminal offence for a long time in Iraq to have any association with Israel, and given 125,000 of us went there, including in my case my dad, I'm not going to go there. And I think it was 3 years ago that Iraq voted again to make it not just a criminal offence but a death penalty offence, and they haven't executed anyone yet, but I'm not going to try it out, so I'm not going back. And I think by the 70s, when I was growing up in London, it was very clear that we weren't going back, and that it wasn't really being spoken very much in Israel either. So what were we doing it for? We should learn the languages of where we were.
What are we doing it for?
Well, I think it's a treasure that we shouldn't lose. But I don't think it is just the language. I very quickly realised food was going to be a big part of the book. I mean, at the beginning, I didn't want to put food in. I actually said, I feel like Mizrahi Jews are valued for our food, and we have other things to talk about. And maybe it's very easy to talk about the food because it's good food, but we should be talking about the more difficult stuff. Like, let's not talk about the food so much. And then very quickly I realised that this was huge. Claudia Roden said, when cultures start to vanish, it's the food is the last thing that goes. And I realised when I was cooking these meals, these dishes, lots of things were happening. Sometimes I would look down at my hands and I would see my mother's hands, and I would think, oh wow, and these are also probably my grandmother's hands, and there are generations of hands here. And then Iraqi Jewish food is there's a lot of handwork, there's a lot of rolling and punching and stuffing, and so you were using your hands all the time, and I was kind of, I thought, I'm doing with my hands these very specific things that are quite hard to do if you haven't seen someone do it or done it with you, that have been done for generations, and I'm doing it. And then I thought, when you're putting the food in your mouth, you are tasting the taste again. So I felt like it was almost like I can't go back, but I can take myself back to that place by eating this, by making this, and then by sharing it, because yes, again, even if I became fluent, well, I can speak it within my community, but I couldn't speak it to anyone outside of that. But I could share the food with non-Iraqi Jews, and that's a way of a door into into what we've lost and what we still have. I started with this idea of the ark. The idea of, I became quite obsessed with the idea of Noah. He sees his world is going to vanish, and he's asked to put on what he can onto this kind of boat in order to take it forward into an unknown future. And he has to decide. Well, I mean, he doesn't really choose, does he? The animals come on 2 by 2, but there is some sort of decision-making process that goes on. There are other versions of the story where he takes one of each kind of craftsperson, which is interesting. And I felt like, what can I take? What can I take, and what can I then do with it at the other end? Again, Noah, one of the things I thought about him is, he always gets a bit of bad press because the first thing he does when he comes off the ark is he plants a vineyard so he can get drunk. And, I mean, it's quite, I think that's what you would want to do. But at the same time, I was very taken by the idea that the first thing he does is he comes out of this trauma, of this danger, of this horror, and he puts his hand into the soil to plant a root. So I was very interested in this idea of, how do we root ourselves in these foreign soils, and how do we carry our culture and then take it somewhere else and keep it going, keep it growing,
It's very beautiful and it's very tactile.
Yeah.
It's a very tactile book for a book about that at least begins with the premise of language, which I think is amazing. And you do talk about how the language itself carries ideas of different senses, and how you want I think it was you wanted your son to feel the taste of the koba on his tongue, and you have very very beautiful descriptions of this world that then comprises the arc that you're trying to build for yourself and for all of us. I want to ask you about demon bowls, because I was asked to ask you about demon bowls, and I wonder if this is a totally opposite direction from the conversation. That's fine, but we need to hit it. So let's talk about that now, and then we can get back to the rest.
Well, I mean, I wanted to write about. I started with the things I knew, you know, and a lot of that was food and words and whatever. And then I was looking. I started doing research. I mean, one of the other first things I did was I interviewed over a long period of time my grandmother, my mother, and my father. I knew their stories, but I had all these gaps, and it's incredibly healing and connecting and helpful psychologically to fill in those gaps. I found it. I think everyone should do it. So then I sort of felt like I'd had this kind of amassed this pile of things that I knew, and I wanted to go back. I wanted to know what else is uniquely Iraqi Jewish. And I was fascinated by these demon bowls. Some people call them incantation bowls, magic bowls. So no one knows why, but from the 6th century in Mesopotamia, people made these little clay bowls, and they wrote on them in spirals on the bowls, and they mostly buried them in the thresholds of houses, and sometimes they sort of bitumened them, sort of cemented them in. And for a long time, I mean, archaeologists at the beginning were sort of throwing them away, going, they're crockery. And then people going, well, why are they cemented into the doors of the houses? You know, that's not what you do with your plate after you finish eating. You know, what is it? So there was all these questions. And then they thought that for a long time, archaeologists thought they were mostly written by men, and they were mostly written not by Jews. And now there is this turnaround where they think they were mostly written by Iraqi Jews, or Mesopotamian Jews really, and women. So what they were, they had spells on them to cast out demons, and you would go to, you know, if you were having some kind of issue, you know, you felt that your house was haunted, or, you know, you had lost a child, or, you know, whatever was going on that was difficult in your life, you would go to these magic women and say, I think, you know, this demon is behind it. Lilith was the main demon that was behind it, and you would go, can you make me a bowl and write something on it to get her to stop? And they would make these bowls, and there was a whole ritual to how they would make them. And it's really interesting because at the same time, the Talmud is full of rabbis saying there's all these women doing magic and they should stop. And I guess because, you know, you might try a rabbi first and then go to a magic woman if it hadn't worked, or vice versa. They were in competition with each other. I was really fascinated by this. The bowls are supposed to be placed this way, you know, down, like almost to trap the demon. So I went to the British Museum in London to look at some. They are now, after literally for 100 years or so, archaeologists were chucking them in a bin, thinking they were just boring old crockery. Now they are prized, and there is a roaring trade on the black market, and almost every museum in the world has some. So when I went to the British Museum to look at them, to my horror, they were all facing up. It was like the demons were ranging free around the Iraq study room. Anyway, and you're supposed to spin them, and there's a whole thing. And the more I looked at them, they didn't look like traps. And I was like, you know, the idea that you trap these demons, like a sort of, I don't know, a scorpion or a mouse or something to trap. And I kept looking at them, and I was turning them, and they're very soft, it's very tactile. I mean, you just want to hold them. And you have to turn them to read them because the writing spiraled. So I was obviously not reading them, but I was turning, and they were written in Aramaic. I was turning them. And I suddenly thought they looked like little homes. And the idea that that you take a demon and you say, look, I've made you a little home, and you put it at the threshold of your house. There it is. And then your demon is there, and you have the rest of your house, and they are not troubling the rest of your family. They have their own home. And I thought, something very psychologically amazing about you name and shame your You know, you name and contain, not shame. You name and contain your demon, and you give them a home, and then they don't come into the rest of your... Anyway, it felt very useful to me. But I love that we had these traditions that I didn't know about, that were in... These were written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which is the precursor of our language. So actually lots of what's on the bowls, lots of the words and things and the structures are in what we're speaking every day, which I thought was kind of gorgeous and amazing.
What to do with our demons and our enemies is a very Iraqi Jewish Rosh Hashanah activity. For those who know, we all know, don't we? Okay, the last thing I want to ask you before I open it up to questions is along those lines. So it sounds like on this journey that you've gone, that was spurred on by the desire to kind of save the language, at least for yourself, it's opened doors of knowledge for you, both into our history and our community, but also into yourself. And so my last question for you is not what you learned about Iraqi Jewish history, what you learned about the Iraqi Jewish community and our story, but what do you know now about yourself, about why you are the way that you are, because of those who came before us in the language that they spoke?
Yeah, I learned lots of things. I'm not going to do all of them. One of the things I learned, when I was becoming a lot of this turned out to be about mothering and parenting, and when I was becoming a mother, I sort of knew I was going to become a mother, and I didn't really know I was going to become a Jewish mother, and I was like, oh my god, I'm this sitcom character, you know. And then I realised actually I'm a very Iraqi Jewish mother, and that's something I definitely I kept recognising these things in every story. I was like, oh yes, there it is again. I also felt...
Well, I don't want to interrupt, I'm sorry, but you say an Iraqi Jewish mother and then having an Iraqi Jewish mother and her having an Iraqi... I just need to know what that means to be an Iraqi Jewish mother. Please,
okay,
the people need to know.
So in the UK it had a different title, but this book, as you know, is always carry salt, and we carry salt to ward off the evil eye. I have gone back and forth on this through my life. As a child, I don't know if I'd be very interested to know if everyone was the same. As a child, I was terrified that I might experience the evil eye, but also I might have it. Both of things terrified me. And for those who don't know, the evil eye is a free-floating kind of evil force, and it can go into anyone and be activated by jealousy. So I was, you don't compliment people, because, if I say, I'm going to literally say something, you don't have a nice hat, you don't have a hat, so I'm not doing it. But if I say nice hat, oh my goodness, that maybe I'm jealous of Jordan's hat, and now something terrible will happen to his hat, it will explode. This is the kind of thing I was terrified of as a child, and I was terrified if it happened to me. And I got to about 12, and I had a complete turnaround, and I said, this is ridiculous, I'm not doing this anymore. And my mum used to literally sew salt into the hems of my clothes, and there was a party. We went to a henna party where you put henna on the bride's hands a few days before the wedding, and I had a really nice dress, and I didn't want it crackling with little sachets of salt from McDonald's that she'd collected. And I was, I said, I'm not doing this. And I remember my mum was really upset. She was like, something's going to happen. And I said, no, nothing's going to happen. It's fine. We were in the car. My dad was more of a rationalist, and he was going, let her do what she wants. It's not. And my mum was going, something terrible is going to... Anyway, we get to the party. It's very nice. For 2 hours, nothing terrible happens. Then we start doing the henna. And they have this idea that all the girls will carry these candles and stand around the bride. So we're all carrying these candles, and I had hair down to here, and I looked suddenly, and there's flames shooting up my hair, and my grandma's cousin banging my head, put out the fire, people are chucking drinks over me, orange juice, champagne, whatever, knocking about. I mean, I was so upset. Anyway, I go into the kitchen where my mum is in the kitchen with some of the other women, and I'm looking, I'm a drowned rat. And my mum's like, well, you see. I love my mum, she didn't mean it, but, it was this. And now I don't tell my son, but I do put salt into his, into the pockets of his trousers. I do it. I do it. I can't stop myself. I do it. He doesn't know. I haven't told him I'm doing it.
And you were going to say one more thing besides that about who you are, how you found something out about yourself and your way of being because of where we come from.
And this is more like general, I suppose. I did a lot of thinking about trauma and generational trauma, and I spoke to a therapist who deals with generational trauma, and I did so much thinking about this, and I was so anxious about it, and I spent lots of time worrying about, how am I going to pass on these stories to my child without passing on the trauma, and, I got sort of almost fed up of thinking about it, particularly since my family were like, what trauma? Because we don't see it that way. That's not a word that we would use in the community. But what I realise is that we're also passing on strategies for healing, strategies for resilience, generational ways of coping with this stuff. And I realised I was doing all these things that I felt that I was passing on, that I was already passing on. So even if I end up passing on the trauma, that I'm also hopefully passing on these other things, that we were gathering a lot, that we were talking about things a lot, that we were sharing things a lot, people were listening to each other. And, I realised that I'm not particularly religious, but we do all the sort of holidays at home, the festivals at home. And there's that old joke that all Jewish festivals boil down to the formula, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. And I always used to find this terrifying. What do you mean? Why are we eating that? We don't know why we survived. You're not telling me how you survived. I need to know how you did it so that next time I will be able to do it again. I need some details, I need a plan. So I always found this joke very stressful. And then I realised it's the last two words, the let's eat is the thing. It's not I'm going to eat by myself, it's we're eating together. Let's eat, we're all together. And also we're sitting down like all together to share food, literally to nourish each other. And I found this, I thought we're doing this thing of, and I thought this particularly at Passover, everyone's sitting around complaining about how much they hate the matzah, we're all having a sort of, and I thought, this is what you were supposed to remember, we're supposed to imagine we were coming out of Egypt. What a luxury to get to the other side of that sea and all that horror and criticise your own picnic. I mean, this is a kind of absolute definition of freedom and kind of, sitting around and criticising it. And I thought, well, this is, that's something I can pass on. These strategies for healing, which it felt very empowering, actually.
I really like that. And in a community that's only going to get smaller, the best thing that we could do is sit around and talk about these things and question these things. And what I think that your book has done for me, and I think for a lot of us who've read it, is that if I wanted to give somebody a roadmap for being an Iraqi Jew, there's very few books on that list that I would be able to put. And this is definitely one of those books. So thank you. And I want to open that up now to questions from the audience to see what you all think about this. And what long-lost family are we going to find now in prison?
Hi. Thank you very much. This is absolutely fantastic. So there is Iraqi Jewish community in exile in Israel. What language are they speaking? And how much of this have they preserved? And I'm sure I'm sorry, I haven't read the book. I'm going to, but what was your interaction with them and the preservation of the language there?
Yes, so half of my family are in Israel. My dad's side of the family. They were encouraged. Like Yiddish speakers, the Mizrahi Jews were, a victim of a decision to have Hebrew as the national language. We lost those other languages. They were also encouraged, but they were encouraged to speak Hebrew. There was a lot of shame around speaking Arabic. My father and my aunt used to say, let's not talk it on the bus. Lots of people describe being embarrassed by having a sort of an Iraqi accent when they were speaking Hebrew. However, I would say that in recent years there's been a revival, and that extended beyond the language to the whole culture. So just to give one example, there were so many Iraqi Jewish musicians. There was a point in the 40s where most musicians in Iraq were Jewish. And when they got to Israel, not only did they find that in Iraq their songs were being attributed to other people or just called anonymous or folk music, but when they got to Israel, they were encouraged not to play what was, sort of being described as the music of the enemy, And so these people who had been massive stars, massive stars, were sort of, selling their, records, their tapes, at the bus station. This is the kind of thing that was going on. But now there's been this huge revival of Mizrahi music, and the language, I think some of it will come along with it. But unfortunately, because the Jews who were in Israel mostly left in 51, we're now several, 2 or 3 generations. So you know, they're not speaking it. Beyond, you know, it's gone, sadly.
Hi, I just, we both took that class with,
Oh, yes.
I quit because it was impossible, and I couldn't. I mean, after a semester is too. But what was interesting is that well, both of my grandparents on both sides are Iraqi Jews, and my father's brother was born there, etc. And then some went to Israel, some went to Italy, some came to the United States. But so he wanted to get more in touch with that, so he wanted to take the class. But I felt, at least that first semester, you said that there's not much grammar.
No, she's got parents.
Because I felt like that class, there was so much grammar.
There was so much grammar.
So I thought you were saying there wasn't grammar in the language.
No.
Okay, so I misunderstood.
No, there was a lot. I mean, what I meant was my mum, when I said, can you teach me some grammar, said there isn't any in our language, you know, which is why I took the class. But
that's why
You know what I was thinking when you said that, and I had this conversation with somebody just a couple of days ago. You know the joke about about when we cook food and it's like my grandma just says a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I think that there is a parallel with language when it's your first language, and especially when it's not the language of the place where you're living, where you'll say like, oh, this is just what we say. We say for this reason, for whatever. There's various ways of saying each thing, and one person says this is the right way, and the other person says no, this is the right way. When in reality, there can be multiple right ways. Just like this language can hold Turkish and Persian loanword and Hebrew loanwords in an Arabic language, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. But that's probably, I would imagine, what people say when they say there's no grammar in the language.
Yeah, because I felt like that whole class, I mean, I didn't even know
Every
grammar
language
in
has
English.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I was also going to say, just because I guess I'm like third generation, because my grandparents were born like the year after they moved from Iraq, so they moved in the 20s. We're like some of the first Iraqis to ever come to the United States. It's kind of a whirlwind when you're trying to like access your history, but then you also feel like incredibly culturally disconnected because the Americanisms of like the early 20th century also factor into that. And like even like looking at the Ellis Island documents, you can see like my great-grandparents spoke 5 languages. So they did not talk to their kids in Baghdadi, like Judeo-Arabic, for the sake of just having a private language for them to communicate, but not because there was all of these other concerns. And I guess like my family also lived in the 50s. My great-grandma's brother was actually murdered in 73 by the Ba'ath regime. So just kind of having family members either leave Iraq at different time periods, or even go to Israel and then leave for Iran because they didn't want to be in the transit camps, it just established like a very rocky and kind of confusing timeline to navigate. So I empathize and I feel
yeah, and I
that.
think also a lot of Iraqis went to India, they went to Singapore, there were so many kind of satellite communities. I've had, because this book came out in the UK in April, so it's been out for a while, so I've had a lot of letters from people who, like you, their family left a long time ago, and I've had word lists from people of the words that are preserved, even, 100 years after people left and that kind of thing, and they're mixed in with words from where they are, so I had one woman who said, I just don't even know which words are Arabic because we were in India for 100 years. So I went. It was amazing. I went through with my mum, and we ticked the ones that we were able to tell them. But I think a lot of people have that slightly kind of confusing timeline, as you say. It's difficult.
My parents are from Argentina, and I recently went back with them. And they realized, they go in frequently, and they realize that even though they're native Argentinians, they left in 1964 and the language had changed significantly. I mean, the slang changes, and like, it wasn't hard for them to communicate. I mean, obviously they're Argentinian, but it was different. And it's interesting that this language is kind of frozen in time. And so that's just a comment. And my question is, after writing this book, do you have hope?
I have hope.
Hope in this continuum.
I don't have hope for the language being spoken, no. I do have hope for the amazing resilience of our stories, our food. I just feel like there's so much of the culture that is still going and being shared and that people really want to. Again, because this has been out in a while in the UK, so I've had the chance to talk to people. So there's just two things amazing have happened in the last few weeks. In Toronto, a group of about 40 people who are all second, third, fourth generation Iraqi Jews who didn't know a word of the language got together, found a speaker, and they're learning with her. Which is just so lovely. And in Melbourne, Australia, there's a man who is, I think, I can't remember, I think his grandparents left, so he's 2 generations in. And he has set up a monthly music night, Iraqi Jewish music and food night at his local synagogue. And he has found Iraqi Jews that he did not know he had, who are neighbours, who are friends of friends, and he's trying to build a small community in this suburb that he lives in, so I feel like, and people are writing to me about this because they've read the book and they want to sort of tell me, but they are doing these things, and there's so much of this going on. So I have hope for, I do have a lot of hope for our story and our, I don't know, what makes us staying there. Yeah.
As to why your father's family went to England instead of Israel.
Hello? Okay, it's on. Sorry, I think I'm just holding it funny. My father's family went to Israel. He was in Israel for, about, 10 or 15 years or something. And then he moved to London to study, and he ended up staying for quite complicated personal reasons.
Is there in England?
It's a very small community, but it's a very kind of tight-knit community and a very warm community. And I could find you more than 1,000 speakers in London, but what I couldn't find you is their children speaking. So there is a community in London. Yeah.
Because my background is Romaniot, which is Greek Jewish.
It's Greek Jewish, okay.
Yeah. But Greek-speaking Jews, not Latino.
Yeah.
Which is
The Oxford School of Rare Jewish Languages also teaches Judeo-Greek.
Yes, they do.
So you should sign up for it.
They do, it's true. And
It just
it
says your
also
call.
appears in Ross Perlin's book, I think, Judeo-Greek.
It must, yeah.
Yeah, I think so, in Language Nation.
I'm just curious when you speak about your, grandparents and native Iraqi speakers Judeo-Arabic speakers, who have sort of a nostalgia, right? I think I've been hearing a lot of. I'm curious whether there's an identification with, if it is exclusive to the past, or if it retains any sort of hold on sort of a more modern Iraqi population.
I mean, we don't have much contact with Iraq now because we can't go there, and we haven't been able to go there. So as a community, we are sort of cut off. But an amazing, I had an amazing experience as a result when I was working on the book. There was this fruit that I really wanted to try, the nubug. It's a fruit, it's a little bit like a date. It's very small. My grandma was always going on about them. She said that everyone had a tree and there were trees all down the street. She said they're amazing, they're like chocolate. You just grab them like chocolate. Obviously as a kid I was like, a chocolate fruit, I kept saying, well, we must be able to, we can get any, I live in the capital city, we can get anything. And my mum was like, oh, we've never seen a nubug, I discovered it's a form of jujube. It's called a Christ's thorn jujube because it's on a tree which is very sort of thorny. And kids used to be the ones to climb and get it because they could kind of navigate their little hands among the thorns and not get hurt. And I was just desperate to try this fruit. And so I kept asking non-Jewish Iraqi friends of mine in London, does anyone know where you can get it? And what I was told was Sometimes someone brings a suitcase and they sell it from a shop in Wembley, and if you get there in the half hour after they open the suitcase, you can buy. And I was like, I'm never going to taste this fruit. I felt really sad about it. And then my friend Laith, who's an Iraqi Muslim playwright who had never been to Iraq himself, his parents also left before he was born, texted me one day this picture of this little punnet of fruit. And I was like, is this? And he said, I've just brought this, I've just been to Baghdad, I've been to Iraq for the first time, and you've got to come and meet me now because it's going to go off. So I got someone else to pick up my child from school. I zipped across town. I got this punnet fruit. I was like, I don't even know which ones are ripe and which ones are not. This is an alien fruit to me. We took this fruit, I don't know, 15 of them. I mean, they're teeny. It was like very little fruit. But he had managed to go. I mean, I was blown away that he had managed to go and he had taken the time to buy this fruit for me. So we went to. I called my mum. I was straight over to my mum. There was a few other relatives who were turning up. Everyone wanted to have. I pulled the wrap off it, and this very sweet, sharp scent came up, and my mum just went. And she just went, I haven't had these for 50 years. So we all had one. It was amazing. It was an amazing moment. I tried to plant the stones. My neighbour at the time was an amazing gardener. He didn't succeed. I didn't. There's a lot of very bad gardening in this book. My attempt to root was kind of not just psychological. I was also trying to plant things. But we didn't manage to. It's not going to grow in the UK. It needs no cold and no rain, basically. But so there are those moments of contact, but really, we feel very disconnected from Iraq as a community, I think.
I know you said you didn't have a lot of hope for a spoken kind of thing, but I'm assuming there isn't a literature in this language, but you did talk about musicians and songs, and I'm wondering if any of those songs are, have words, and now that is having something of a resurgence, I believe you said, if that is one way to kind of preserve it in that sense. And also, you all who are taking classes, what are you going to do with this? I mean, it's like you can sit around and talk about this. And is there, even if there's not a written literature, is there an oral tradition, as there are in other languages, that stories that are sort of passed down as, there's not that many more generations, but there are some. So I wonder if that's a strategy. That's a really good question. The music was mainly written in literary Arabic, classical Arabic, and this is a problem beyond our community. All Arabic speakers, they speak whatever they speak at home, and then they write or they make music in the classical or literary. So no one is making stuff in the vernacular, and the same goes for the books. So Iraqi Jews did write books. There are lots of books by Iraqi Jews, but they are written in classical Arabic mostly. There's one, there's probably more than one, but there's one famous author, Samir Nakash, who moved to Israel and was determined not to start writing in Hebrew like most of his Iraqi Jewish other writers did, his fellow writers did. And he carried on writing in a combination of our language and classical Arabic. But the result was his books were hardly read in his own lifetime, so they couldn't be read. They were not sold in the Arab world because they wouldn't read books by a Jew at that point, and I don't know whether they are now. And they couldn't be read in Israel because people didn't understand the Arabic. So I've read him in translation, which is better than nothing, into English.
They're amazing too. I mean, highly recommend reading some of his stories. They're amazing.
It would take a lot more classes before we could read them in the original, I think.
One thing I'll just add to that is that in some of the religious tradition, like in Passover, for example, there are versions of the 4 questions. There are versions of that are written in the Haggadah, of the Iraqi Jewish Haggadah, in Judeo-Arabic, just with Hebrew letters, as was common, I guess kind of in a similar way to Yiddish, right? Like the Yiddish is used in Hebrew,
Yes.
Hebrew script.
Yeah, well, I really struggled with this because when I first started talking to the academics, they said it was always written in Hebrew, and I had my grandmother in her 90s, and she didn't read or write a word of Hebrew, and she used to write shopping lists, and it was in the Arabic alphabet, so I was literally going, well, here is a woman who's in her 90s, and she's, I mean, clearly we're talking about a 100-year tradition of not writing it in Hebrew, you know, at least with one person, and she said, I've never seen it written in Hebrew. I think what used to happen is that it was written in the Hebrew alphabet, and then as you know, women started to write, they often weren't given a religious education, so they would write it in whatever they could write in. And then particularly the Jews who left after 51 were writing in Arabic because there was less Hebrew around, so there was less Hebrew education. So it was written in both, but it was mainly in oral language.
But what's so cool about that Passover thing is that in the limited Arabic that I have and that you have is that we can read the Hebrew letters, sound it out, and know what it means better than I can, at least because I don't speak Hebrew when I say it in Hebrew. So there are these vestiges.
Yeah, there are these vestiges, exactly. Yeah.
So we're going to take 2 more questions.
Thank you guys so much for sharing. My background is Syrian, and I feel that the Arabic that they spoke in Aleppo is also getting lost with the younger generation. I do not speak any Arabic, but I know a few words here and there, you know, bad words, food, things that you would say at a social event. Is that happening with the younger generation with Judeo-Iraqi Arabic?
I'd say, yeah, I mean, certainly in my community in London, yes. So I've heard people my age say befrachak, which means to your celebration, which really means may you get married very, very soon. You say it's you know, quite early on. I definitely, obviously the food, we use the food words. So we're not going to translate the names of the food, so you know, that's all going on. Yeah, some of the phrases, the curses, exclamations, I'd say. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think of those as like the high points of the language, the dramatic, the pinch points maybe of the language. You know, the points. You know, that's what survives, I suppose.
Thanks for this. This was wonderful. 2 associative things just off the back of Samir Nakash was recently translated into Hebrew for the first time in a new translation, which is pretty incredible, by Maktub, if you want to look it up. There is a full Judeo-Iraqi Passover Seder on YouTube that you can look up and listen to, which is pretty incredible if you're interested.
Yes.
And then my question is, so I'm curious to hear more about, you know, you talk about strategies of resilience. You know, how do you pass on this cultural tradition, this language, these foods without passing on the kind of trauma that goes with it? Which is a question that I ask myself often. So I'm just curious to hear more about that.
One thing that I did, as I said, I had a few sessions with this therapist who deals with generational trauma, and I was the first Iraqi Jewish he had ever spoken to, because I feel like in our communities there's a sense that there is no trauma. And I said, I can't, she kept saying, you need to set it down. I said, I can't set it down, because if I set it down, it's going to vanish. And then it will not be passed on. I cannot set it down. And I felt really angry with her. And she said, but you can do a bit of sifting. And I found this incredibly powerful, the idea that, I mean, I literally, when she said that, had this image of kind of clouds of flour, and it felt really light. And I thought, yeah, I mean, there are some things I don't want to pass on. There was a lot of culture of shame, particularly of young women. If I can avoid passing that on, I would like to avoid it. You know, who knows whether I will be able to do that, but there are things that I can try and be intentional about. I also thought, I don't like every single recipe. I don't have to cook. And then the other thing I felt was also so I used to be very anxious about fusion food, and I think it was because I felt between cultures. I felt like I'm a fusion person. I'm not one thing, I'm not another thing. And I became, knowing more about my culture and my heritage, I'm freer with it now, and it's very liberating. If I want to add more, I like more cumin than my mum, that's fine. I don't have to be imprisoned in the admittedly amazing way she cooks the recipes, but if I want to add another bit of cumin, I'm going to do that. You know, it's authentic to me. I'm also an Iraqi Jew, and I felt like what I would love is, you know, if my child felt that he could go, do you know what, I hate this cumin my mum's always putting in, I'm not doing it. You know, I feel like if we could be more, we can own our traditions more, that would be helpful, and then you're not weighed down only by trauma, you are carrying it more lightly, maybe, I don't know, we'll see.
Okay, now we're going to take one last question here.
Really quickly, I mean, this isn't really the question, but just with the idea of food and fusion and what is authentic, when I think about Iraqi Jewish food or other Middle Eastern food, and you think of the tomatoes and tomato paste, it's only from the New World, right? Which is interesting to think about that's from 400 years or less than 500 years of using that. But the question I had is, when you have the specific enunciation or pronunciation of the, you know, authentic speaker of the Jewish dialect, how do you encapsulate that when you're trying to teach it? You know, if you have it written in Hebrew with vowels, or in English, it's still hard. You need a lot of the audio to like hear it and try to mimic that sound. So what's that like?
I mean, with the course that we both did, there was using a kind of a sort of standard linguistic transliteration system, which I mean, I found it almost impossible to use. It was in English, but with lots of weird letters and stuff. However, what I found helpful is there's lots of interviews with Iraqi Jews online. There's an amazing man who is, my mother's second cousin, I discovered after I'd started this, Elias Timman, someone you may know him, who created an archive of interviews, and you can hear people speaking, lots of my family were interviewed and other people, and he groups them by, chronologically, so they tell the story. There's a rabbi in Jerusalem who interviews Mizrahi Jews in Arabic, and they're on YouTube. It's called People of the Book. They're amazing. So there are lots of ways to listen to it. So I find a combination of that. And in the book, I transliterated badly into English, but I've done my best, you know.
Thank you so much. If everyone can join me in thanking our wonderful... So I'd also like to invite everyone to continue the conversation downstairs. We're going to be selling some wine, some drinks, and then also Samantha and Jordan will be selling their books. And we invite you to continue the conversation, schmooze with us, enjoy the night. Thank you again.
Oh yeah, sorry, there's a book going around. In the spirit of remembering things and writing things down, I like to ask people where they're from, and I would love to see a lot of, especially Iraqi Jews on this list, but anybody who wants, everybody should sign it if they want to, and it's also a way of keeping in touch with us. So please do that if you feel like it, and please give it back to me. Thank you. Thank you.